Who cooked this?" The mafia boss's voice echoed low, cold, and powerful enough to freeze the entire banquet hall. No one dared to breathe. I stood in the corner of the kitchen, a tasting spoon still trembling in my hand, my heart pounding as if it might shatter along with the faint scent of saffron clinging to my sleeve. I did, sir." Laughter broke out among the chefs. The dishwasher cooked for the boss. Leo Moreau raised his head. His gaze swept over the room before stopping on me. Those eyes cold as steel, yet for a fleeting moment I saw something else within them. Something like a memory awakened by a taste he thought he'd lost forever. He spoke slowly, each word clear and deliberate. "You work for me now." No one understood why. Neither did I. All I knew was that from that moment on, the dish I had cooked changed my fate and his. I am Clara Bennett, the nameless cook who was just pulled into the banquet of sin. The air in that back kitchen turned from thick, steamy heat to absolute zero the second he spoke. And even the head chef, a man who usually roared like a sea captain, suddenly looked small, shrinking back into the stainless steel glare of the ovens, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, unable to process that his world too had just been rearranged by a plate of rice. I could feel the heat of the mockery coming off the line, cooks the ones who had seen me sweeping the floor and scrubbing pans for the last 9 months at minimum wage, just trying to keep my head above water in New York City, after what happened in Florence, the disaster that had left my name a whisper of scandal in every decent culinary circle, the kind of mistake you can never truly outrun. They probably figured this was some kind of elaborate joke, a cruel display of power that the wealthy and terrifying Mr. Moreau was going to drag the scullery girl out and humiliate her just for sport, and they leaned in waiting for the punchline, their contempt a solid palpable thing aimed squarely at my bowed head. But it never came, not from him anyway, just the sound of that cold, clear voice that felt like a sentence being read aloud. When he gave the command, "You work for me now." His voice carried that terrifying finality, the kind of tone that meant this wasn't an offer or a suggestion. It was a new reality being stamped onto the moment, and I instinctively let the tasting spoon drop the clatter on the tile floor, sounding deafening in the sudden quiet feeling, the entire weight of the world tilt sideways, just because I managed to season a risotto the way my foster mother taught me years ago, with a touch of slow-rendered bone marrow, and a meticulous blend of aged Parmesan that had always been her deeply personal, unforgettable secret. A taste that apparently had the power to summon ghosts. I stood there, just the girl in the cheap, slightly stained apron and hair tied back in a serviceable plain braid, my uniform smelling faintly of commercial dish soap and desperation, the smell of my anonymity. And I didn't move until a tall, impeccably dressed man, Adrian Wolfe, Leo Moreau's right hand, and the cruelest reminder of the life I lost, stepped past the line of frozen staff, his movements so smooth they seemed almost liquid, completely composed, and held out a gloved hand, not to shake mine, but as a silent, immediate order for me to follow him, a gesture that immediately stripped me of the few identities I had left, dishwasher forgotten, culinary student, invisible New Yorker, and now I was just property, a possession collected by the boss. The sight of Adrian, my old flame from Florence, the last person I ever expected to see in this gilded cage of power, wearing the uniform of a powerful man, was a secondary shock that hit me right in the gut. A cold, sharp reminder of the bright, hopeful future we'd both planned before the disaster. A life he had successfully moved on from while I was scrubbing grease traps and trying to forget the smell of that fatal mushroom, the smell of death that clung to my memory like old oil, and the casual indifference on his perfect face told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties now lay, firmly entrenched in the safety and power of the Moreau organization, far away from the ruin of our shared past. My heart was still doing that sickening fast drumbeat against my ribs, but the fear was starting to be replaced by a kind of numb exhaustion. The feeling you get when you're standing in a hurricane and decide you're just too tired to fight the wind anymore, so you just let it carry you. Because honestly, what could be worse than what I'd already been through, scraping by day after day, trying to erase the memory of the past, and the reason I couldn't cook professionally anymore, the constant gnawing guilt that had become the unwelcome seasoning in every meal I ate, a bitter undercurrent to my very existence, a guilt that Leo Moreau's sudden command now promised to either extinguish or amplify beyond measure. Before we step out of this moment and into the whirlwind that became my life, because trust me, things are about to get intense, and a lot of what I went through was only possible because I kept my head down and just kept moving, relying on that quiet dignity my foster mother taught me, the kind of inner strength that refuses to bow even when kneeling. I just want to ask you for a second right now to maybe pause your day for a tiny minute. If this story is grabbing you, if you feel that little tug of recognition for what it's like to be dismissed, underestimated, or judged for where you come from, for who you are beneath the surface, would you mind taking a quick second to reach for your phone? Like this video, leave me a comment below so I know you're watching and who you are, and hit that subscribe button to walk with me through the rest of this journey. It helps me more than you know. And it means we can keep sharing these messy, unbelievable, but totally real moments together, finding strength in the quiet truth, and knowing we aren't alone in feeling unseen. Thank you. Now back to that moment when Adrian's gloved hand signaled the end of my old life and the beginning of, well, whatever this terrifying, uncertain future was going to be, a future that was already starting to smell dangerously of expensive leather and gunpowder. Adrian, the man, who was now guiding me out of the kitchen and through the hushed, cavernous hall where the banquet was winding down, moved with such smooth, lethal efficiency that I had to almost jog to keep up my cheap shoes, clicking awkwardly on the marble floor, a loud, vulgar sound in the quiet space. And as we passed the linen-draped tables, I could feel the collective weight of every powerful judging gaze on my back, the whispers starting like a low, venomous tide. Who is she? What did she do? The boss is losing it. Each whisper like a tiny, sharp needle pressing against my skin, trying to puncture my composure, but the shame I thought I should feel never arrived. Instead, there was just this strange, cold clarity that settled over me, a quiet observation that none of these people draped in silk and diamonds truly understood what real loss or consequence looked like, living in their bubble of calculated risk and superficial judgment. And their condemnation was as thin and brittle as the empty wine glasses left precariously on the table, easily swept away. Adrian, whose face remained a mask of professional disinterest, never once looked back at me. Yet every slight adjustment in his pace or shift of his shoulder communicated that he was acutely aware of my presence, walking a step ahead, but always positioned to block any casual glance from the guests, a subtle form of protection. I instinctively distrusted, knowing it was for Leo's property, a prized new asset, not for me, the person. As we passed the table where Mr. Moreau, Leo was now standing calmly adjusting the cuff of his perfectly tailored suit jacket, his movements slow and deliberate, a king rising from his throne. Adrian paused, giving me just enough time to look up and meet the boss's eyes again. A brief, silent exchange, where that flicker of memory I saw before seemed to intensify, burning away the cold exterior, for just a split second before the mask snapped back into place, and he simply gave a nod toward the waiting armored car outside, a gesture that dismissed me as a person and secured me as a thing all at once, establishing his ownership without ever uttering a second word or needing to look at me again. The transition from the noisy, overheated scullery to the insulated silence of the black sedan was jarring, the kind of vehicle designed to mute the entire city, making the real world feel impossibly far away. And the ride to the Moreau estate was done in absolute silence. Adrian riding shotgun while I sat in the vast leather back seat, sunk into the luxurious cushions, the kind of car that smelled expensive and slightly dangerous, like aged wood-rich cologne, and the faint metallic hint of a recently discharged weapon that told me exactly the kind of business these men conducted, a business built on ultimate consequence. It was during that drive, staring out at the blurred lights of the city that was swallowing me whole, watching the faces of normal people blur by, that I finally allowed myself to tremble, gripping my hands tightly in my lap, feeling the texture of the rough linen apron I still wore against the smooth, luxurious leather of the seat, a physical reminder of the two worlds that were now colliding inside me. The stark difference between my humble reality and the opulent, terrifying world I was being pulled into, a world where the stakes were clearly measured in life and death, not just minimum wage. I tried to focus on the taste of the risotto, replaying the cooking process in my mind, searching for any detail that might explain this radical reaction. But it was just the dish I'd learned, the one I poured every bit of quiet, meticulous care into, the kind of care that always made my foster mother smile, the kind of cooking that felt like the only honest thing I had left after the ruin of culinary school. And the accident, the memory of slicing the fatal mushrooms, the judge's sudden collapse, the screaming and the guilt of it. That profound, life-altering mistake was a flavor I could never wash out of my own mouth, even now a bitter undercurrent to everything I ate or created, and the thought that this food, this single perfect dish, might be my final undoing, filled me with sick resignation and a desperate, quiet curiosity about the man who was now my owner. When we pulled through the massive wrought-iron gates of the Moreau property, the sheer scale of the mansion was dizzying, a fortress of gray limestone and manicured shadowed gardens that looked less like a home and more like an embassy of power, totally isolated from the world. I knew, surrounded by 10-foot walls and silent guards, where the air itself seemed colder, thinner, and utterly silent, pressing in on me from all sides. A monument to a kind of untouchable wealth I had only ever glimpsed in movies, a castle of shadows and secrets. Adrian led me through a maze of cool marble corridors, past priceless art that looked dangerously fragile, and silence so profound it felt heavy, where my footsteps, even in my soft shoes, seemed to echo too loudly, amplifying my anxiety, until we reached a grand professional-grade kitchen that dwarfed the one I'd just left, equipped with appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum of modern design, shining silver and cold steel, everywhere a chef's paradise turned into a gilded prison. For the first time since leaving the banquet, Adrian spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion, like he was reading directions off a sign laying out the laws of my new confinement. "You are the private chef. You report only to Mr. Moreau. Your quarters are in the West Wing. You will be provided for, but do not mistake provision for freedom. Do not leave the grounds. Do not speak unless spoken to. You will be observed at all times, Clara. Understand that this is a privilege, not freedom, and that privilege is entirely conditional on your obedience." The words were harsh and clear, establishing the boundary immediately. I was not a guest, not even an employee in the conventional sense. I was a function. A quiet tool pulled into service a highly paid, utterly controlled prisoner, and as he turned to leave, his expression briefly softened, a quick flash of something that looked almost like pity, a strange, misplaced sorrow, a look I quickly dismissed, because I learned long ago that pity is just another form of judgment, and coming from him felt like a deliberate insult to the quiet, enduring strength I was now forced to muster just to survive the night and figure out the truth behind Leo's obsession. My new life began in the silent early mornings, preparing Leo's coffee exactly the way Adrian described it, black, scalding, and served in a specific heavy ceramic mug that had a slight imperfection on the handle, a small chip he always touched with his thumb, a tiny human habit in a man who seemed otherwise immune to vulnerability, a detail I filed away as a possible weak spot. And as the days stacked up, I cooked everything he requested, from simple continental breakfasts to intricate multi-course dinners, always watching him from the peripheral vision of the kitchen door, never daring to look directly, observing the ritual of his consumption. I observed the way he ate, the way his jaw worked, the way his eyes would sometimes close for a moment after the first bite of a new dish, a silent, almost painful concentration that made it feel like he wasn't tasting food, but tasting memories, sifting through the layers of flavor for a ghost. He couldn't grasp a woman he had clearly loved and lost, maybe his mother, judging by the desperation in his stillness. It was unnerving, this ritual, this silent, profound connection built solely on flavor, and I started noticing that he would often request dishes that felt deeply personal, almost archival recipes that weren't common, and that I had only learned from the old handwritten notebooks my foster mother had collected over the years. Notebooks that I carried with me everywhere, faded ink on brittle pages that I now kept locked in a small metal box in my sparse, functional room. The coincidence of his requests felt too sharp, too precise, and it was only a matter of time, a few short weeks, that I started feeling less like a chef and more like an artifact being studied, realizing that every successful dish was not earning me praise but earning me suspicion, each perfect flavor deepening the look of troubled contemplation in his eyes, making him look less like a terrifying boss and more like a deeply wounded man searching for an answer. Only I seemed to possess an answer hidden in the recipes I unknowingly carried. The requests became even more specific, testing the limits of my knowledge, and I found myself researching obscure Italian regional dishes recipes that hadn't been widely published in decades, realizing that he was using my cooking as a highly refined investigative tool, a DNA test for my soul and my lineage. The pressure was immense, knowing that a single misplaced herb or a failure to match the exact emotional tenor of a dish could be the end of my life. But the pressure also sharpened my focus, pushing me to produce food that was not merely technically perfect, but emotionally resonant, pouring all my quiet integrity into the flavors, determined that if he were to condemn me, it would be based on a lie, not on the quality of my work. I started observing the guards and the flow of the household, mapping out the architecture of his power, understanding that the kitchen was my sanctuary, and my battleground the one place where my quiet expertise gave me a form of undeniable, if temporary, authority. My quarters, small and functional in the West Wing, offered little comfort, but the small metal box containing the faded recipe books became my only tangible connection to the past, the true source of the knowledge that had both ruined and now saved me. The paper, smelling faintly of dried vanilla and old spice, a world away from the cold steel and marble of the estate. The final request came on a day when the air felt thick and heavy, the kind of day that promises a coming storm, the sky outside turning an ominous pewter gray, reflecting the mood of the house. And he asked for a dish called anima nera, or black soul, a complex ancient Italian recipe involving a specific rare herb and an intense black truffle oil that I knew was central to a dark, complicated family history. A dish so specific I knew it could only have belonged to his mother, confirming my rising panic that I had reached the end of his test. I was searching for the precise spice blend in the enormous shadowed pantry, the blend he had vaguely requested that morning, something called polvere di segreto, when I heard a low, tense conversation from the office just down the hall, the sound of Leo's cold voice cutting through the silence of the massive house, his tone one of furious certainty laced with frustration and raw pain. The name, Moreau's mother, cut through the silence, followed by Leo's voice, sharp as broken glass, demanding to know the source of the recipe, and why it echoed the tastes of his past with such damning accuracy, confirming all his worst suspicions about my lineage. I froze, the jar of smoked paprika still in my hand, listening as Adrian's calm, level tone confirmed my growing fear, the quiet certainty in his voice driving the truth home like a spike, that the risotto Milanese recipe I cooked, the one that brought me here, was the exact intricate signature of a chef who had betrayed the Moreau family years ago, the very man who was indirectly linked to his mother's death, Julian Vance. Hearing that I understood everything that had felt wrong, the quiet study, the intense scrutiny, the lack of compliments, I wasn't here because of my skill. I was here because he believed I was the link to his mother's killer, the daughter of the traitor. And every dish I made was a test, a forensic examination of my soul, looking for the taste of betrayal buried deep within my blood, a flavor I was innocent of possessing, but could not escape a profound injustice rooted in fate. I stood there in the dark pantry, the cold realization sinking deep into my bones, a kind of terrible, heavy weight that made the light-headed panic of my old life seem preferable to this sophisticated, calculated danger, knowing I was trapped in the middle of someone else's vengeance, and that the only honest, beautiful thing I had left, my cooking, was the very thing condemning me, now revealed as an incriminating piece of evidence that superseded all logic or my own honest intentions. The recipe wasn't my father's. The woman who raised me, who saved me after Florence, who taught me to see cooking as an act of pure, quiet love, never told me who gave her the notebooks, never told me about the history tangled up in the dried basil leaves and the saffron threads. She simply passed down the knowledge, the skill, and the quiet dignity with which she lived a legacy of flavor, untainted by blood, a gift that was now my curse. And so I walked out of that pantry, closing the heavy door quietly, deliberately returning the paprika jar to its shelf, my quiet dignity suddenly feeling like the only weapon I possessed against the weight of his suspicion, deciding in that instant that I would play the role they assigned me, the quiet, unassuming chef, his temporary obsession while secretly working to find the truth, because I couldn't bear the thought of being judged guilty for a legacy I didn't even know existed, determined to prove that my hands were guided only by integrity, not by inherited darkness. No matter how convincing the evidence against me appeared, to be prepared now to face whatever confrontation awaited. The tension in the house was a palpable living thing, a fine layer of dust covering the opulence, and it mostly coalesced around Evelyn Moreau, Leo's sister, a woman whose beauty was sharp and intimidating all angles and expensive tailoring, who managed the family's labyrinthine finances, and whose eyes, unlike her brother's, held no flicker of mystery, only pure cold disdain every time they landed on me. A woman who measured everything in status and profit margins, and hated any variable she couldn't control. She saw me not just as a servant, but as a threat, an inexplicable variable that had suddenly hijacked her brother's focus and threatened the carefully balanced ledger of their power. And she made it her personal mission to ensure I knew my place in the hierarchy, which was somewhere below the gardener and slightly above the cleaning supplies, never missing an opportunity for a subtle cutting insult, delivered with a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes, trying always to provoke a reaction that would expose my lower-class origins. One evening, she cornered me in the formal dining room, the huge, dark space empty, save for the two of us, the crystal chandelier casting cold, brilliant light on the mahogany table. As I was setting up for a small private meeting, Leo was hosting meticulously, aligning the silverware, and she watched me place the implements with an almost aggressive stillness, leaning against the marble fireplace mantel, like a predator, admiring its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike and assert her superiority. "Do you know what that flatware is, Clara?" she asked, pronouncing my name with a thin, mocking exaggeration, drawing out the syllables until it sounded ridiculous, tasting the word like sour milk, and finding it entirely unappetizing, a clear insult to my background. I continued setting the table, my movements slow and precise, refusing to speed up or show anxiety, simply responding, "It is sterling silver, Miss Moreau, requiring very careful handling to avoid tarnish as its age makes it delicate, particularly the filigree on the handles." Her laugh was short, dry, and entirely humorless, echoing briefly in the grand room like a gunshot. "No. It is the silver inherited from my grandmother, a legacy that represents more wealth than your entire family tree has seen in 3 generations, a lineage that matters in this house, unlike your own, hidden and likely shameful one. Just so you understand the difference between what belongs to us and what belongs in the scullery, it's the difference between provenance and cheap necessity. Clara and you, my dear, are undoubtedly the latter, a disposable accessory." And then in a casual, deliberate movement that felt more like a calculated assault than an accident, a test of my servitude designed to break my composure, she reached for a half-full glass of deep red burgundy, sitting on a nearby server cart, and with a subtle flick of her wrist managed to spill the entire contents directly down the front of my pristine white chef coat, watching with a small, satisfied smirk as the expensive wine spread across the cheap fabric, soaking through to the skin beneath the dark liquid, looking exactly like fresh blood against the stark white of my uniform, a vivid, humiliating stain that was impossible to ignore. The blood-red stain seemed to scream my low status against the backdrop of the opulent room, a clear sign that I was merely a trespasser. And I stood there for a moment, the cold, sticky liquid chilling my chest, hearing her follow up, with a condescending, cutting remark, delivered in a low, conspiratorial voice. "This house isn't for cheap cooks, Clara. It's for people who understand value, who know their place, not those who leave a messy stain everywhere they go. Your kind simply doesn't belong here, so please remove that disgusting garment and go clean that mess up." I didn't flinch, didn't wipe the wine, didn't even breathe a sigh of resignation, forcing myself to remain utterly still until the initial shock passed, recognizing her act as a cheap ploy to provoke me. But instead, I simply looked down at the ruined coat, letting the expensive stain seep in for just a moment, marking the humiliation, then back up at her meeting. Her gaze with a steady, quiet resolve that she clearly didn't expect from a servant. A look that said, "Your cheap drama doesn't change my worth, only yours." I picked up the discarded linen napkin, slowly, deliberately dabbing at the front of my apron, my eyes holding hers the entire time, acknowledging her power over the wine, but utterly denying her power over my spirit. I spoke only 2 words, my voice soft but utterly unwavering, cutting through her arrogance like a sharp knife through butter. An answer that was a promise of resilience, not submission. "I'll clean it," and then I turned away. Not retreating, but simply returning to the kitchen to gather a fresh coat, leaving her standing there by the fireplace. The triumph draining from her face as she realized I hadn't crumbled or cried, but had instead shown her a quiet, enduring strength, that her petty cruelty rooted in insecurity and status couldn't even begin to touch a strength that she instinctively understood was far more dangerous than any outburst. Just 20 minutes later, after changing into a dry coat and trying to scrub the last vestiges of the wine stain from my memory, focusing intensely on the metallic tang of the sink water, to distract myself, Adrian appeared in the doorway, his usual stoicism slightly off-kilter, his eyes darting quickly to the damp front of my clean coat, a silent, almost guilty acknowledgement of his sister's cruelty that he couldn't hide before returning to the file he held. He was my former lover, the one I had shared dreams of Michelin stars and a life built on pure flavor within Florence, where we used to steal late-night pasta and whisper about our future restaurant, promising each other forever over a shared bowl of cacio e pepe. But that history was now buried under layers of his cold loyalty to Leo and my own profound shame, making him feel like a ghost from a life I no longer recognized, a beautifully tailored delivery man, for my fate, his presence a constant low-grade ache. He didn't mention Evelyn, or the wine didn't even look me in the eye, just pressed a thin manila file into my hand with a quick, urgent pressure that felt like a plea for forgiveness, masked as a helpful warning. His fingers briefly brushing mine, a fleeting contact that felt electric and wrong before stepping back. His voice barely a whisper against the running water, the sound muffled by the hum of the ventilation system. Leo's tracing it. Every connection. He knows about the culinary school, the accident, the notebooks. He's looking for a direct blood tie. You need to know this, Clara, and you need to be careful with the anima nera. It's his mother's last recipe, and the taste is the last thing he holds on to. The way he spoke my name, tinged with a residue of old affection and a strange, desperate urgency, was almost more painful than Evelyn's hatred. Realizing that he was betraying Leo out of a deeply wounded sense of what we once were, a twisted attempt to reassert some control over our shared destiny. The confidential file, warm from his hand, felt like a burning coal in mine, and when I finally opened it in the solitude of my room later that night, locking the door and pulling the curtains tight to shut out the massive, accusing silence of the mansion, it confirmed my worst suspicions. A detailed diagram showing the Moreau family tree, the chef who betrayed Leo's mother, Julian Vance, and a large red question mark drawn precisely where my name would connect, highlighting the coincidence of the risotto recipe, the culinary school attendance, and the fact that I was orphaned at the right time, the circumstantial evidence against me mounting like a fortress. Seeing it laid out like that, the cold, calculated evidence of my capture, the betrayal felt sharp and immediate. Not because Leo suspected me, but because Adrian, the man who had once sworn to protect me from the world, was now the one delivering the intel on my execution, confirming that he was prioritizing his own survival over my truth. And I knew then that my recognition wasn't based on my talent at all, but on my potential to be a useful enemy. A pawn in Leo's long game of power and vengeance, a pawn of fate, a fate I refused to accept, passively vowing in that quiet moment to turn his obsession into my protection, because the truth of my character was my only possible defense against both his suspicion and Adrian's desperate manipulation. I didn't sleep that night, sitting instead on the edge of my bed, staring at the file, and then at the old ink-stained recipe notebooks, running my fingers over the faded script of my foster mother, feeling the rough texture of the paper beneath my thumb, realizing that the only way out was to shift the narrative to prove my value, not as a relative but as a person, to make my actions speak louder than any document or bloodline, a lesson in quiet strength and ultimate self-reliance. I knew that chance would come only in a moment of pure, undeniable crisis, a situation where only my unique skills, my hyper-awareness of flavor and chemistry, the tragic consequence of my past, could save the man who simultaneously feared and obsessed over me, the only way to shift his focus from my bloodline to my loyalty. The very next night, Leo hosted a small, very private dinner in his personal study. Just him, Adrian, and a high-ranking family captain. and I was responsible for serving the wine a rare, expensive vintage that Adrian had uncorked earlier, a rich Barolo that smelled of cherry and earth the last quiet moment before the storm. And as I approached the table, the air thickened with a premonition I couldn't ignore. As I poured the deep, shimmering liquid into Leo's glass, first following the strict protocol, then the captain's and then Adrian's, my entire body went rigid when I caught a subtle, almost invisible scent that cut through the robust aroma of the old wine. It was faint, almond-like and horribly familiar, a ghost of the scent that had haunted my nightmares since Florence, confirming instantly that this was not a social drink, but an execution planned right under my nose. My blood ran cold, recognizing the trace profile of a specific deadly neurotoxin, the kind that had no taste, but smelled faintly of bitter almonds, and that I had studied exhaustively after the Florence disaster. A scent I was now hyper-aware of, due to my own traumatic past, a professional reflex born of tragedy that saved a life this time, instead of taking one. My mind didn't have time to process the logistics. Why was it only in Leo's glass? Where did it come from? Who was the intended killer? It was just pure instinctive reaction, a frantic, immediate need to stop what was about to happen, a force more powerful than any fear I felt, a desperate, urgent necessity. Without a word, without pausing or calculating the terrifying cost of my actions, without a second thought for the consequence, I simply lunged forward, not toward Leo, but toward the glass, striking his hand with the edge of the heavy silver serving tray. I held the movement precise and violent, sending the poisoned crystal goblet flying across the room, where it shattered against the stone fireplace with a loud, sickening crack that seemed to shake the foundations of the mansion, announcing the violence and my sudden dramatic shift from servant to disruptor. The room went silent instantly, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion, and Leo, startled and suddenly furious, was staring at me, a few drops of the spilled wine spotting his immaculate shirt, while Adrian and the captain were already half out of their seats, hands instinctively reaching toward the small concealed weapons they carried, assuming I was the assassin who had finally made her move, fulfilling their darkest suspicion. Evelyn, who had just entered the room, drawn by the crash, took one look at the shattered glass and the overturned chair, and her eyes went straight to me. Her voice cutting and laced with immediate venomous certainty, seizing the opportunity for my destruction, her face contorted with triumph and malicious glee. She did it. She's trying to poison you, Leo. She's the traitor's daughter. Punish her now before she finishes the job. Look what she's done to the room. That's proof of her evil blood. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and absolute. And I stood there motionless, my chest rising and falling quickly from the exertion, the silver tray now clutched against my side, not offering a defense, not explaining the smell, knowing no one would believe me over Evelyn, just watching Leo's face, which was dangerously calm, devoid of any discernible emotion as he looked from the shards of glass on the floor to the cold, accusatory glare of his sister, and then finally back to me, waiting for my reaction. I didn't beg, didn't point, didn't cry. I simply held his gaze, my hands steady now, waiting for the inevitable verdict, offering him the silent, undeniable truth of my intention, the proof of my loyalty delivered not in words, but in a chaotic, desperate act of violence aimed at saving him, a gamble that risked everything. For a moment that felt like it lasted a century. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth, and the ragged sound of my own breath. And then Leo slowly lowered his hand, a movement that stopped the other men mid-reach, and instantly diffused the crisis. The true power of the room resting in that silent command that was more terrifying than any weapon. He surveyed the scene once more, the spilled wine, the broken glass, Evelyn's furious, demanding face, and my quiet, unmoving figure, and he spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying a terrible binding authority that silenced the entire room, extinguishing Evelyn's accusation in an instant, cutting her off mid-sentence, his eyes never leaving mine. "No one touches her," he stated, his gaze fixed on Adrian, who immediately lowered his hand, his face unreadable, his eyes flickering between Leo and me with a sudden dawning terror that suggested he knew more than he let on. "She is not to be questioned. Clean up the glass, Adrian. The meeting is over." The entire organization was stunned by his silent public protection of me. It was the first time the boss had ever chosen to shield an outsider over the demands of his own blood, a silent verdict that I was, for whatever reason, suddenly worth defending, an act that felt less like love and more like a heavy, unexpected shield of debt placed over my shoulders, cementing a dangerous and complex bond between us that confused everyone, including myself, transforming me into an untouchable figure of mystery and fear. His defense of me changed everything. The atmosphere in the estate shifted from cold suspicion to bewildered deference, and the servants now avoided my gaze with a new respect, whispering in hushed tones about the chef's immunity, and the boss's strange fascination, while Evelyn's hatred became a visible, smoldering presence in the house, a wound she couldn't heal, and an insult to her pride that only fueled her dark ambition. But the biggest change was in Leo, who now watched me with a completely different kind of intensity. No longer the forensic study of a suspect, but the quiet, troubled contemplation of a riddle that defied his expectation. His act of protection, forcing him to question his own, carefully constructed beliefs about my guilt. Acknowledging that the taste of my cooking was an honest reflection of my character, an integrity that contradicted every file he held, I continued to cook, of course pouring even more care and precision into every dish, now finally preparing the anima nera he had requested. The dish I knew was heavy with the weight of the past, hoping that the integrity of my cooking, the honest flavor of my intention, could finally drown out the poisonous taste of suspicion that still lingered in the air between us, replacing it with the profound language of culinary truth, using the only currency I truly possessed to buy my freedom and maybe earn his trust. The quiet, fragile new balance of power shattered again when Rafael Cortez, the ruthless Spanish mafia lord and Leo's long-standing rival, chose his moment to strike, leaking a meticulously crafted dossier to the entire network of families during a seemingly innocuous quarterly meeting of the 5 boroughs, a calculated move to humiliate Leo publicly and force his hand. The dossier was a poisonous cocktail of half-truths and clever fabrications expertly timed to cause maximum humiliation, culminating in the bold, devastating claim: Clara Bennett, current private chef to Leo Moreau, is the daughter of Julian Vance, the chef who betrayed the Moreau family years ago. The information, however false, landed like a massive bomb, creating chaos and ridicule among the allies and enemies alike, painting Leo as a sentimental fool whose weakness for a woman would cost them all their respect and standing. I heard the echoes of the mockery first, the cruel ringing laughter carried on the telephone lines, and whispers that filtered down through the servants' hall, who now looked at me with a mix of fear and pity. The boss sleeps with the traitor's daughter, what a tragic joke, how compromised he must be. The disgrace was immediate and profound, a public humiliation for Leo that threatened to destabilize his entire power structure, challenging his authority and legitimacy in a world built on fear and cold logic, and the backlash was severe. Evelyn, smelling blood and a final desperate chance to reclaim her influence, stormed into the grand hall where Leo was standing, his face carved from granite, her own face rigid with fury and a twisted sense of family honor, seeing this as her last best chance to save the family name from disgrace and seize control. "You must end this, Leo. You must kill her," she demanded, her voice shrill and unforgiving, echoing off the high ceilings like a desperate broken bird caught in a trap. "Family honor demands it. She is a liability, a weakness that Raphael is exploiting. If you don't do this, you lose everything. Your respect, your position, everything our mother built. Kill her now and prove your loyalty to us. Prove you are still the boss." I was already standing in the middle of the cold marble floor, having heard the whispers and the accusations, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. And I didn't wait for Leo to speak. Instead, I simply sank to my knees on the unforgiving stone, the cold seeping instantly through the thin fabric of my trousers. My head bowed, my hands resting palms up in my lap, adopting the posture of utter quiet submission that I knew would silence the dramatic tension of the room far better than any shouted defense meeting. The tragedy with dignity and quiet acceptance, giving him the chance to save his face without forcing me to beg. My voice, when it came, was steady and low, carrying a profound sense of resignation that felt honest and real, devoid of panic. A quiet offer of my own life. If it is true, if this is my blood legacy, If I am truly a danger to you, then end it, I whispered, looking up at Leo, who stood frozen, his face a mask of conflict, his hand already moving toward the small silver-plated pistol concealed in the inner pocket of his jacket, the familiar gesture of deadly decisiveness, now agonizingly slow and painful. I will not be a source of betrayal for you again. Do what you must to restore your honor. My life is yours, Leo, if that is what it costs. The air was so thick with tension that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, the pressure of his choice threatening to crush me. And I waited there kneeling, accepting that my short, strange journey in the underworld was ending with a single tragic bullet. The consequence of a past I didn't choose finally catching up to me in the form of a man who held my life in his trembling hand, torn between his family legacy and the undeniable truth he had tasted in my food, a terrible final test of loyalty, where either choice would shatter him and the fragile trust we had built. Leo's eyes were blazing a mixture of pain, confusion, and a terrible cold decisiveness as he slowly drew the gun, the heavy, expensive weapon emerging from its holster, the sound of the metallic slide echoing in the cavernous hall, a promise of imminent violence that was pointed not at me, but at the entire room. He took a single slow step toward me, the weapon leveled, and I closed my eyes, accepting the finality of the moment, the cold stone pressing into my knees, thinking only of the taste of saffron and the kindness of the woman who raised me, hoping she would forgive me for not being able to outrun the darkness that found me. But the shot never came for me. Instead, a sharp, deafening blast ripped through the air, followed immediately by a collective gasp from the few guards who had gathered their weapons, now drawn and pointed toward the sudden source of chaos. When I opened my eyes, Leo was standing over me, his gun smoking, not aiming at my head, but at the man who was now clutching his chest, a dark stain blossoming on his crisp white shirt. Adrian Wolfe, my former lover, the man who had stood so rigidly by Leo's side for years, now sinking slowly to his knees, dropping the manila file that had started this entire deadly spiral, the truth revealed in a flash of violence, the ultimate proof of Leo's terrible mistake and misplaced trust. Adrian looked up at me, his eyes wide with a combination of pain and regret, the old love momentarily fighting through the shock, and his confession spilled out in a ragged, broken whisper that was just loud enough for Leo and me to hear his voice catching on the pain and the rapidly failing breath. Raphael bought me Clara. He promised me power, a clean slate, everything you and I were supposed to have, everything he took from me. I couldn't stand seeing you look at him, seeing you love him, Clara. I couldn't stand being second to his blood and his legacy. I made the file. It's all fake. It was me. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Adrian was the source, the architect of the false dossier, the final vicious betrayal designed to destroy Leo from the inside, using my past as the perfect poisoned weapon, his love twisted into a jealous, murderous obsession that cost him his life. Adrian reached out for me, the gesture heartbreakingly familiar from our days in Florence, and I instinctively moved, crawling forward and cradling his head in my lap, feeling the last of his breath hitching in his chest, a profound sorrow washing over me for the lost man. He once was a tragic, bitter end to our shared dreams, looking up at Leo, whose face was completely, terrifyingly blank, stripped bare of all emotion, watching the woman he suspected was his enemy, now holding the man who had actually betrayed him. The complexity of the scene, a final cruel twist of the knife. The scene was devastating. The truth unmasked, the betrayal confirmed, and the dying man cradled by the woman accused of his own crime, a portrait of profound, irreversible chaos. The marble floor stained with the blood of the real traitor. And Leo simply stood there watching the life drain from his closest confidant, and I could practically taste the raw, bitter jealousy rising off him, a darker, more complex emotion than any vengeance he had felt before realizing in that instant that his greatest fear was not being betrayed by a rival, but by me choosing another man, even a dying one. His face, usually a mask of control, was now contorted by that possessive, agonizing jealousy, and he looked from Adrian's fading face to my tear-streaked one. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles stood out like cords, and then he spoke, his voice quiet, colder than ice, a possessive, absolute declaration that cut through the lingering shock and the sorrow, marking a profound shift in his entire philosophy. He didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't even address the confession, but simply delivered a new chilling decree to the stunned guards and his sister, who stood watching her face white with shock and failure. "From now on, she's not a servant. She's mine. You understand, mine." That single sentence was his decision. His absolute choice. He was choosing love, or at least his possessive, fractured version of it, over the dictates of blood and legacy. And in that moment, I went from suspected enemy to protected asset, the object of his cold, dangerous affection. The truth of my character finally revealed not by my words, but by the undeniable evidence of my actions in saving his life and grieving the life of the true traitor, marking me as his and his alone with a terrifying finality that promised a new, unknown form of captivity. The aftermath of Adrian's death settled over the estate like a thick, choking fog, the air heavy with unresolved grief and suspicion, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the faint scent of Adrian's expensive cologne, a visceral reminder of the terrible cost of loyalty and jealousy. But before we could even begin to process the fallout, Rafael Cortez, operating with the confidence of a man holding the ultimate key, released the next stage of his attack, sending the entire organization into a tailspin. He leaked footage of Leo and me, brief private moments, a stolen kiss in the garden, a hand resting on my shoulder as I worked in the kitchen. Intimate moments he had engineered Adrian to capture the ultimate proof of Leo's emotional vulnerability, turning me, the quiet, unassuming chef, into the visible, undeniable weakness of the Moreau Empire. Proof that the calculating boss was distracted, compromised, and governed by emotion, a vulnerability his enemies could exploit openly. This was the final straw for Evelyn, who, already furious and humiliated by her brother's defense of me, saw her chance to seize control, making a swift, calculating alliance with Raphael, providing him with the internal details he needed to mount a successful assassination attempt on Leo, choosing ambition over loyalty, a move that exposed her own deep-seated resentment and thirst for power, which had been festering for years under her brother's authority, believing that only she was fit to rule. The attack came quickly and brutally, a planned ambush during a routine trip downtown that Leo miraculously survived, though he was badly injured and required immediate covert care, bleeding out in the back of a van, while his men fought desperately for his life in a hail of gunfire, the sounds of which reached even the isolated estate. In the confusion and subsequent chaos, I was captured by Raphael's men, dragged from the kitchen I had claimed as my own, and taken to a fortified, sterile safe house, a concrete box hidden deep beneath a warehouse on the waterfront, where Raphael himself was waiting, his eyes gleaming with triumphant malice, enjoying the spectacle of my terror and helplessness. He didn't want to kill me quickly. He wanted to destroy Leo utterly, to break his spirit with one final devastating act of betrayal that was both culinary and emotional, and he forced me into a kitchen identical to Leo's, a mocking replica designed to break my sanity, handing me the ingredients for a grand final feast. A meal that was in truth a highly potent, fast-acting poison meant only for Leo, the last supper of the Moreau Empire, a dish meant to kill with the taste of false hope, and the hand of his beloved. Raphael stood over me, watching every careful move as I worked his presence, a cold, suffocating weight in the small, echoing kitchen, savoring his power over me, whispering his venomous philosophy into the quiet heat of the kitchen. Love tastes best when it kills Clara. You will cook him the dish of his death, the dish of your supposed affection, and when I serve him the news of your death, he will realize he lost everything because of a scullery girl who meant nothing but trouble, a fool's weakness. He gave me the poison, a crystalline powder disguised as a finishing salt that shimmered innocently, demanding I fold it into the complex sauce of the main course, a classic cacciatore that Leo loved, and I faced the impossible choice: cook the poisoned meal, and be responsible for the death of the man who, despite his darkness, had chosen to protect me, or refuse and die instantly at the hands of Raphael's guards, gaining nothing but a pointless martyr's death, a choice that tore at my resolve and threatened to break my quiet strength. I knew I couldn't sacrifice myself without fighting, not when I held the power to change the outcome in my hands, a subtle power, hidden in the chemistry of flavor. I looked down at the array of spices, the shimmering powder in its small vial, the rich, aromatic sauce bubbling gently on the stove, and I felt a quiet, terrible strength bloom in my chest, a cold, rational clarity that pushed aside the panic and the fear of death, realizing that my life in the kitchen, the skills I had honed to perfection, the deep instinctive knowledge of flavor and chemistry were now the only tools I had left to fight the chaos of the underworld. The final weapon I possessed, the power of the cook. I played the part of the compliant prisoner, feigning tears and submission, letting my hands tremble slightly as I prepared the main elements, weeping silently as I mixed the spices, acting the role of the broken victim to lull his guard. But as Raphael turned away for a brief moment to speak with his guard, stationed near the steel door, his attention momentarily distracted by his impending triumph, my fingers moved with the speed and precision of a lifetime spent training. I did not put the poison into Leo's dish, but instead with a subtle shift of my ingredients, a quick, precise replacement of one herb for another. To mask the substitution, I incorporated the lethal powder into an exquisite dark reduction sauce I had prepared for Raphael's own accompanying side dish, a decadent saffron risotto he had ordered for himself, a move only I, the chef who understood the chemistry of every flavor and the deadly composition of the toxin, could have executed flawlessly without detection, turning his weapon back on him with the ultimate irony. The rest of the preparations were a blur of calculated movements, my heart beating a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs, masking the truth beneath the polished gleam of the final presentation, my hands working tirelessly to ensure the trap was perfectly laid, adding garnishes with a terrifying calm, and when the dinner was finally plated, a magnificent, deceptive display of culinary art, the poisoned risotto shining darkly on Raphael's plate, looking utterly innocuous. Raphael dismissed his guards and sat down with a satisfied, greedy smile, demanding I join him, the ultimate gesture of his control and twisted desire to see me humiliated, one last time to savor his victory over Leo through me. He raised his fork for the first celebratory bite of the side dish that contained the altered reduction, savoring the flavor that he believed was the prelude to his total victory. Closing his eyes in a moment of arrogant pleasure, and as the paralysis began to spread from his throat to his limbs, the look of confusion slowly freezing on his face, the realization dawning that he had been outsmarted by the one person he thought was weakest. I leaned in close, watching the terror bloom in his eyes, and whispered the cold, hard truth of my quiet, unassuming strength, the finality of my culinary revenge. You just ate your last supper, Raphael. The cook you underestimated just served you justice, and it tastes exactly like bitter almonds. The moment of my victory was immediately shattered by the violent sound of automatic gunfire and crashing glass, as Leo, pale but driven by a furious primal need, having tracked Raphael to the safe house, burst through the reinforced door, his guards moving with ruthless, synchronized efficiency to neutralize Raphael's remaining men, the fight erupting around the meticulously set dining table, destroying the elegance of the moment. The room dissolved into a scene of terrible, bloody chaos, shattered china, and spent casings scattering across the floor, and I remained standing by the table, my hands covered in flour and the scent of saffron, watching Raphael's paralyzed, terrified form slumped against the chair, already suffocating on his silent, helpless rage, consumed by the very poison he intended for his rival, a tragic culinary end. But the danger wasn't over. Evelyn, having followed Leo's trail, emerged from the shadows, a desperate final fury in her eyes, raising a gun and aiming it directly at my head. Seeing me as the source of all her family's ruin, the last obstacle to her power, and her desperate craving for control, determined to finish the job her brother had failed to do. I didn't flinch, didn't move to cover my head, just stood my ground, my quiet defiance burning brighter than any fear meeting. Evelyn's desperate gaze with a quiet, solid strength she would never possess. And in that split second, Leo moved, a flash of selfless, desperate speed that defied his recent injuries. A final, defining act of protection, prioritizing my life over his own, shielding me with his own body as Evelyn fired the shot. The sound of the bullet striking flesh was sickeningly final, the thud of the impact absorbed by his frame, and Leo slumped, groaning, but still standing the heavy, life-ending impact, having gone straight into his chest, while Evelyn was immediately tackled and disarmed by his remaining men, her final act of betrayal, costing her everything, her position, her freedom, and the last shred of her brother's respect. Her scream of denial cut short by the force of the guards as they dragged her away to face the consequences. I rushed to him, catching his weight as he fell, his blood staining my white coat, the true dark color of loyalty, a sacred stain. And with the last vestige of her fury, Evelyn screamed his name before being dragged away, facing the devastating consequence of her misplaced ambition and betrayal. The natural fallout that comes from choosing power over family and honor. The next few hours were a frantic, desperate scramble to save Leo, a covert extraction and emergency surgery in a secret location far from the city. A tense, silent waiting game where every passing minute felt like an hour. And when I finally saw him again, he was pale, scarred, and miraculously alive, breathing shallowly. But the world had fractured inside his mind. The shock of the near-death experience, the trauma, and the complex chemistry of the incident, having erased the entire chapter of his life that included me, a devastating final irony that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. The once cold, calculating boss was now an amnesiac king, his memory wiped clean, seeing me only as a nameless, comforting face, the quiet chef who tended to his wounds with a professional, distant care. And for me, the danger was still too profound. The entire organization too fractured by the chaos and the loss of its leader's memory. And so I made the hard choice. I walked away from the underworld, from the power, from the complicated, terrifying man I had come to love, disappearing into the quiet anonymity of a new life, leaving behind the only man who had truly seen my value beyond my circumstances, carrying the weight of his forgotten protection and the promise of a peaceful future with me. I shed the name Clara Bennett, exchanged the marble fortress for a small, salt-weathered cottage on the coast, under a false name, Isabella, trading the tension of the city for the relentless rhythm of the ocean, finding a quiet, enduring solace in the endless waves, the sound of the surf washing away the echoes of gunfire, and opened a tiny seaside restaurant, 1 table per night reservations by word of mouth, only where I could pour my focus back into the pure, honest act of cooking, using my skill not as a weapon, but as a form of quiet, meticulous healing, a testament to my survival and resilience. The days turned into months, the memory of Leo becoming a distant, painful ache that I learned to live with like a chronic burn, checking the local news for any sign of him. Until one blustery late autumn evening, the bell above the door chimed, announcing a break in the routine, and a scarred stranger walked in his face, etched with hardship and a quiet, unsettling intensity that seemed familiar. But his eyes were empty of recognition, devoid of the complex history. We shared a ghost of the man who once commanded fear now, just a customer seeking warmth and food, drawn inexplicably to my quiet sanctuary. He sat at the single table, ordering the daily special, a simple, refined fish stew. I had perfected his movements, slow and deliberate. The careful way he positioned his scarred hands on the table, reminding me of his old, meticulous nature. And as he took the first tentative bite of my latest creation, his entire body seemed to freeze, a shudder running through his frame, and the utensils dropped from his hand with a small metallic clatter that echoed in the quiet room. He looked up, his gaze locking onto mine as I stood quietly by the counter, and in that moment I knew that while his brain remembered nothing, his soul, his body, the very core of his being, recognized. The taste I poured into my food, the pure, unique language of my cooking, a flavor that was inextricably tied to his lost memories, a culinary fingerprint he couldn't deny, a feeling he couldn't explain. He asked the question that had started this entire deadly circle, his voice rougher now, scarred by the memory loss, but still carrying that familiar, commanding cadence that raised the hairs on my arms, a desperate plea for an answer he didn't know he was seeking, compelled by a force he couldn't understand. "Who cooked this?" He asked, the words ripping out of him, like something torn from a deep, hidden place, a sound of profound internal agony, and I looked up, my heart seizing in my chest, seeing the raw, honest confusion in his eyes, the absolute lack of any memory of me, only the pain of a taste that hurt like something he once possessed and had violently lost a connection his subconscious refused to sever. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I silently turned back to the kitchen, preparing the one dish that held the key to the very beginning of our terrible journey, the single recipe that held the ghost of his mother, the fear of his enemy, and the truth of my character. The final piece of the puzzle, the only medicine that could heal his fractured mind, the culinary equivalent of turning back time. I brought the dish out to him myself, a small, meticulously prepared plate of risotto of memory, the dish that had pulled me from the scullery, and into his dangerous life, the exact risotto Milanese that started it all, placing it gently in front of the man, who was now just a stranger in my quiet restaurant, offering him the truth in a bowl. He looked from the dish to my face, then back to the food, the rich golden hue and the familiar intoxicating aroma drawing him in, and he raised the spoon, taking a deep, concentrated bite, closing his eyes as the ancient specific flavors hit his palate. The taste bypassing his logic and striking his memory center directly, a chemical reaction that rewrote his past. With that first taste, the floodgates opened, not a gentle trickle, but a violent rush of memories, the sight of Adrian's betrayal, the smell of gunpowder, Evelyn's furious face, my quiet defense in the dining room, the taste of the saffron, the feel of my body beneath his shield, everything hitting him at once. Restoring the man I knew, and the dark world he inhabited, the pain and the love colliding inside him. He bolted from the table, knocking the chair over, running out of the restaurant, and into the cold, driving rain, desperately searching for the woman who wasn't just a cook, but a catalyst, the key to his broken identity. The ghost he had been chasing for years, shouting my name into the wind, and I just stood at the window watching him search, knowing that the flavor had finally healed the wound in his mind, that I had given him back his past. He came back minutes later, soaked and panting, pushing the door open and walking straight to me, his eyes now blazing with total terrifying recognition and profound relief. The cold mask finally shattered, and he spoke the words that ended our cycle of debt and suspicion, finally acknowledging the truth of our connection, the realization that settled over his scarred face like a new truth. You never worked for me. You completed me. Together we closed the door on the world of poison and power, opening a secret, small, one-table restaurant where every meal was an act of pure, quiet grace, and the only transaction was the honest flavor of our mutual hard-won survival, a testament to the fact that strength isn't about the power you wield, but the integrity you carry and the truth you stand on. In a world of poison and power, love remained the only taste no one could counterfeit. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.